05 Sima. Most of the histories of the Dark portray the Church of Tal as a monolithic, single-minded faith ruling over, and often contending against, a double handful of rebellious city-states. While it is true that the Church was more unified and organized than the city-states, much to its advantage, it was not a single monolithic structure. Records of the period indicate that it was a confusing tapestry of smaller saints' faiths, usurped local religions, and holy cults of personality. Add to this the wide variety of divided dogmas and outright heresies within the Church of Tal's ranks, and it becomes obvious why the Inquisitions, and the later Crusades, were formed. Of course, it should be equally obvious that those Inquisitions and Crusades were infested with the same disputes over dogma, cults of personality and outright heresies as the rest of the church hierarchy. Arkal, Argivian scholar. Jodah found his way back to the Alamar River and began following it south toward the Great Bridge. He considered heading north, far from the madness of the warring city-states, particularly since his wounded leg was feeling better, but the need to find Fosca was too great. He moved quietly, keeping the languid flow of the river to his right as he moved south during the morning and afternoon, finding shade in the heat of the day. He used his spell of light sparingly, to light fires in the evening and once to stun a river rat long enough for him to catch it for supper. He found he developed greater strength and control over the light as he repeated the process of casting the spell. Yet, his achievements would mean little if he could not reach also or. He was hampered by the fact that he did not know who, if anyone, was winning the war. He met no one along the river's side, but found a large amount of abandoned equipment, enough to deck himself in also Orion garb and still carry the fragments of his Ghed armor in his backpack. He had also found among the cast-offs a bottle made of carved crystal, filled with rum. Regardless of who controlled the bridge, he would be prepared. In the end it did not matter. When he arrived at the bridge on a gray, overcast morning, also our forces controlled the northern end of the Great Bridge, and Ghed forces the southern. Neither seemed particularly pleased about the presence of the other, but there seemed to be a lack of unsheathed weapons, and traffic moved effortlessly from one side of the bridge to the other. Indeed, a large caravan was encamped on the far side of the bridge in Ghed territory. Jodah stopped an ostler who was bringing up fresh horses and asked what had happened in his absence. "War's over," said the stableman. Church negotiated a peace treaty between the two after the Battle of Pitdown. "Stragglers like you have been coming in for about a week now." "You were there?" "I'm afraid I was," said Jodah. The ostler sucked on his teeth and said, "I heard it was bad enough," said Jodah. "So one can travel to also or, then?" "One can," said the ostler, "but unless one feels like camping outside the city walls, one shouldn't." Jodah raised a tired eyebrow at the other man. "The plague flag flies over also or," said the ostler, "like it did earlier over Ghed. The cold grip, or something like that, this time. Nasty bit of work, I hear. Your stomach freezes into a solid lump, as I understand it, and you die trying to pass it out of your body." The older man shook his head sagely at the encampment on the far side of the river. "That's why this lot is heading south to Ghed. Can't say I blame them." Jodah raised his head and poked a chin in the general direction of the encampment. "And who are this lot?" The stableman leaned forward in a conspiratorial fashion. "Churchmen," he said simply. "The church?" Jodah blinked. "Since when does the church leave a city, even one with the cold grip?" "Part of the treaty, I hear," said the stableman. "They have a cartload of heretics, wizards, and sinners that they're going to burn in Ghed." "I see," said Jodah, thinking at once of Fosca. Would he be among the prisoners? "They're going to tie them to stakes and set them on fire, the first morning they get there." "Burn them alive," said the ostler with a grin. "Sort of a welcome to the neighborhood party." He broke down in a wheezing laugh. "Charming," said Jodah. "And they're heading for Ghed." "Indeed they are," "Good sir," said the stableman, "indeed they are." Jodah let the stableman go about his business and paused only to change out of the tattered remains of his also Orion uniform and into the tattered remains of his Ghed armor. The also guard sneered at him but let him pass. The Ghed guards, on the other hand, challenged him as he approached. He gave his assumed name and his former unit. The commander of the bridge guards checked a large board. "You're a survivor of Pitdown?" he asked in a nasal braying. "That's what they call it, I suppose," said Jodah, trying to remain professional. His eyes swept the church encampment. Could he find a way to join the caravan south? Should he? "That was over a week ago," said the commander, an accusing whine in his voice. "I was separated from my unit," said Jodah, and shrugged. "I didn't have a map with me." The commander made a dismissive snort and hooked a thumb toward the encampment. "Join up with the church guard. They'll be escorting Her Grace Primata Delphine and the holy prisoners to Ghed. Then you'll be reassigned once you get there, or discharged. War's over, you might have heard." Jodah stared at the bridge guard commander in disbelief. "Is there a problem, soldier?" said the commander, his whine growing indignant. Jodah snapped back to reality. "No sir." "Thank you sir." Gathering his backpack, Jodah made his way to the church encampment. The encampment was nearly packed and ready when he arrived and was a hive of activity. Jodah looked for someone in charge but without luck. He also looked for where the holy prisoners were but with similar lack of success. Somebody behind him shouted something, but Jodah continued to scan the crowd. There were a number of Ghed soldiers, and some of them had a wide-eyed, slightly terrified visage. Other survivors of Pitdown, he guessed. He wondered if he too had that painfully honest expression on his face. He felt the mirror on the inside of his boot but did not reach for it. Someone shouted again, but Jodah's blood ran cold when he saw Delphine, Primata of the Order of St. Zil, being helped onto her horse. Her mount was a huge white gelding set with an ornate, box-like seat that allowed the large woman to sit side-saddle. Despite himself, Jodah felt like turning away. Surely his beard and ragged attire would disguise him after all this time. The Primata looked up, and for a moment Jodah thought their eyes locked. His blood froze, and his heart dropped into his boots. But the Primata's face remained impassive, or at least no more irritated than she normally seemed, and she gave no hint that she recognized Jodah. Then a heavy hand was laid on Jodah's shoulder, and he jumped 3 feet in place, twisting to face his assailant as he did so. Togath backed up 3 steps, taking his hand off Jodah's shoulder as he did so. "Did the battle leave you deaf, man? I called you, and you seemed lost in your own little world. Tal's book, it is good to see that you survived the battle." Jodah took a deep breath and tried to calm his thundering heart. Togath had called him by his assumed name, the one he had enlisted under, and he had ignored it. "I'm afraid Lve wandered a long time to get here," he said. "You and I both," said Togath, then lowered his voice. "Though there should be few more boring jobs than guarding Our Lady the overstuffed suet bag. At least we deserve the rest, eh?" Jodah smiled and was rewarded with another slap on the back. At last the company formed up. Jodah and Togath's group was assigned to the rear guard, which meant that the rest of procession had to pass before them. First came the vanguard, the fresh troops sent from Ghed, their lamellar armor waxed a lustrous black, and their freshly laundered tunics as green as a sun-dappled forest. Then came the outriders, similarly outfitted and colorful. Then the Primata's horse, followed by a number of lesser church officials, either mounted on horseback or in personal carriages. Then a lumbering wagon, which, Togath mentioned, contained either the church treasury from also or several thousand copies of the Book of Tal, or both. Then another unit of footmen, this group more ragged and practical looking than the vanguard. Then came several wagons holding the holy prisoners, then Jodah's units in the rear. The wagons holding the prisoners were only a little larger than the donkey carts that hauled Mother Dobbs away. They were stuffed with prisoners who were manacled and hobbled, and the monocles of a few were tied to the railing of the wagon. They were an uninspiring group. If the church was to be judged on the strength of those who opposed it, there was little that could be said on its behalf. Indeed, it looked as if the church had emptied also its jails and dungeons in order to provide a sufficient stock of sacrifices. Togath could note, but did not, that the prisoners were examples of the enemies of the church in the way poverty, dirtiness, sickness, and famine were considered enemies, for they were all clear examples of those traits. Jodah scanned the prisoners, looking for Fosca's face, then goggled in surprise. At the prow of the third wagon, her wrists manacled with ornate chains, was the blue-clad woman from the alley. Her garb was tattered prisoner gray now, but her heart-shaped face and bangs were unmistakable. Jodah stared at her, she turned slightly, and her eyes met Jodah's. As with the primata earlier, he got the feeling that she saw him looking at her, but this time there was the feeling that she recognized him. Her head bobbed just a bit, and she allowed herself a small smile, and she turned back to face the direction of the procession. The last of the prisoner wagons rumbled by. There was no sign of Fosca among the prisoners. Togath elbowed Jodah and said it was their turn, and they collected in the back of the van with the other shabbily dressed survivors of Pitdown, bringing up the rear. Asterisk 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 asterisk. It had taken little effort to volunteer both himself and Togath for guard duty, except perhaps Togath's unwillingness to get only a half-night's sleep after marching all day. It took a bit more persuasion, and the salvaged bottle of rum, to arrange to be assigned to guard one particular prisoner. Most of the sinners, criminals, and ne'er-do-wells scheduled for the Inquisition pyre were put into one large tent for the evening. Those who might provide particular problems were given their own quarters and their own guards. So it was that Togath and Jodah ended up in the early hours relieving the guards of the Blue Woman's tent. Jodah noted that the church was much more serious about its prisoners than the Ghed military was. 2 guards were posted to each tent and told in no uncertain terms to keep all outsiders out until relieved. Jodah waited until most of the guards were changed throughout the camp and the area began to settle down. Then he said, "I'm going to go into the tent, Togath. I want you to stay here." There was silence a moment, then Togath said, "So that's what this is all about?" Jodah looked at the larger man quizzically. Togath shook his head. "All this effort, for a bit of fluff. Can't you just wait until you get back to Ghed? I know of a very good house in the docks district." Jodah understood what the guard was saying and shook his head violently. He could feel the blood rushing to his face in embarrassment. "That's not what I meant. I need to talk to this prisoner." Togath blew out his cheeks in a derisive snort. "Yeah, that's what I always said, too. Just wanted to talk. Never ends up that way, though." Jodah felt his face grow hot. "I'm serious, I'm looking for somebody." "So are we all, lad, so are we all," said Togath, then gave Jodah a long, steely look. "Go on, then. I don't think the church will care, and she'll be kindling in another day. I'm going to move off a little, here and keep lookout for the watch commander. Just keep it down, if you don't mind." Jodah wanted to argue with the other guard but instead just shook his head and unbuttoned the tent flap. As he slipped in, Togath gave one last shot. "And don't take too long. I think I might need a good long talk as well in a couple hours." He punctuated the remark with a nasty laugh. There were supplies in the tent shoved against one wall, with a cleared space in the middle. In the center was a great iron peg driven into the rocky soil, and a short chain linked the peg to the prisoner's monocles. It was similar to the method that the Ghed military had used to keep their captured spy, but the iron peg, the chain, and the monocles themselves were inscribed with a spider-like tracery of thin silver lines. Similar, Jodah noted, to the monocles that had bound Fosca. "It's about time you got here," said the Blue Woman, now dressed in gray. Jodah scowled, a hand out, palm down, motioned for her to lower her voice. He didn't trust Togath to not stand by the tent flap and listen to what was going on. "I need some information," Jodah said in a level tone. The woman raised her crossed and bound hands. "What, no rescue? And here I thought you'd come to free me." She shook her head, and her hair swept across her face like waves. "Sorry I didn't contact you sooner, Jodah of Giva province. I been a little busy." There was not a hint of apology in her voice. "I want to know about Fosca," said Jodah, kneeling down opposite her, figuring how long the chain truly was and staying outside her range. The woman held up her wrists again. "Free me first." Jodah shook his head. "Information first. You left me puking in an alley last time we talked." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it felt as if she was trying to carve her way into Jodah's soul. He sat there, unmoving, waiting for her to make her decision. At length she licked her lips, shut her eyes, and said, "Fosca is dead." "I'm sorry." Her shoulders slumped slightly forward as she said it. That did sound like an apology. The bottom dropped out of Jodah's stomach at her words, and he felt dizzy for a moment, a repeat of the feeling he had in that alleyway. It was not magic that brought on the vertigo, but fear. Fear that the woman was speaking the truth. "No," he said at last in a whisper. He should have gone back to Also or immediately after he escaped that city. He never should have left Fosca behind. He never should have split up from Fosca in the first place. He never should have cast the spell that brought the church and the goblins. "I am sorry," said the woman, raising her crossed wrists again, "but we don't have time for this. You have to get me loose." Jodah shook his head again. His mouth worked, but there was no sound for the moment. Finally he managed, "How? How did he?" The woman settled back on her haunches, and her face was a combination of concern and impatience. "That doesn't matter." "No, I'm sorry, it does. Short version is all I know. They apparently caught him soon after you got away. He put up a fight. They shot him with crossbows. That's what I put together, after they caught me." "No," said Jodah firmly, "we captured a spy from Also or. He said that Fosca was alive. That the church had him." "The church put out that information," said the woman quickly. "They were hoping you would hear and come back to rescue him." She paused a moment, then added, "They caught me, when I came looking, instead." There was a long silence in the tent. Jodah's face felt flushed, but not from embarrassment. Fosca was dead, and it was his fault. The woman waited for a moment, then in a low, stern voice said, "You understand what happened? They put out a false rumor in hopes of getting you to come back. They wanted you. I think they still do, from the questions they asked." She held out her wrists a third time. "Can we go now?" Jodah blinked back the wetness at the corners of his eyes. Could he trust this woman? Was Fosca really dead, or was she just telling her own story to get him to free her? He looked into her cold, blue eyes and saw that she was serious. And there were a dozen other stories she could have told instead. Fosca was dead, and the church was still looking for him. He looked at the monocles. "I don't have the key," he said. "I don't know. I mean I can't." He stammered. The woman sighed impatiently. "Of course you can." "I can't, because they are welded onto me. If I try, the feedback will overwhelm me." "You can. Just open them with a spell." Jodah looked at the monocles carefully now. They had a thin joining line along one side but no sign of a lock or catch. "I don't know how," said Jodah in a small voice. "I don't know that spell." "So make it up," hissed the woman. "What's your color?" Jodah looked at the manacled woman with disbelief. "My what?" "Your color," The woman strove to keep her words to a whisper, but it seemed a losing battle. I don't believe that Fosca never. Okay, we'll take it from the beginning. What spells do you know? I can make bright light appear, he said. Bright, hot light. And I take it that's what got you away from the primata in the first place, said the woman. Apparently that put a real wrinkle in her wimple. What else? I can make potions, with the right material, he continued, then spread his hands out wide. You know that as well. I haven't been doing this very long. I can see that, said the woman, with a bit of ice in her voice. Jodah looked in her eyes and thought he saw gears turning as she strove to figure out what to do next. At length she said, when you cast a spell, what do you think of? Think of, said Jodah, then realized what she was saying. I think of my home, where I grew up, in Giva. Mountain, plains, seacoast, prompted the woman. There were mountains in the distance, said Jodah, but it was mostly farmland. Orchards. Vineyards. Gardens. Plains, then, said the woman. That fits with the curative magic and the light balls. All right, here's what we can do. I want you to pull out the magic of your land. You know how to do that? Jodah nodded, and closed his eyes. He was back in Giva, back at the family manse. Slowly he pulled the energies from those memories and shaped them into a glowing white ball in his mind. Good, said the woman, what are you envisioning? I am thinking of a white ball of light, said Jodah. That ball is the mana, the magical energy, said the woman. Now I want you to keep thinking of that ball and open your eyes. Jodah did so. Now I'm going to tell you how to shape that mana. I can't be 100% accurate, because it can't really be put into words. Like writing down a dance, said Jodah, feeling a fresh twinge of regret for Fosca. The woman almost smiled. Almost. Close enough. Now I want you to shape the ball into a disc. Flatten the poles, and imagine the edge of the disc is so narrow that it can easily fit into the seam of these monocles. Can you do that? I can try, said Jodah, flattening the ball in his mind. Then he asked, have you ever done this before? Made a spell on the fly, asked the woman. Yes. One time I had to do it for another mage who had his hands trapped like mine. Did it work? Said Jodah. The disc of mana was a spinning vortex, and he imagined it moving toward the monocles. Sort of, said the woman. He casts spells one-handed now. Easy. Just let the disc slide into the joint and move along the length of the monocles. Yes, that's it. Togath had wandered a few feet away initially, but curiosity had quickly gotten the better of him. By the time he was back into hearing distance, the voices were soft and indistinct. Maybe the lad had been telling the truth, thought the older guard. Maybe he just wanted to talk to the woman. Waste of an opportunity, he thought, but every man has his own desires. The soft murmuring went on for a few moments, and there was the flickering of light within. Indistinct shadows formed on the walls. The murmuring voices stopped. The lad was getting careless now, thought Togath. One thing to leave one's post for a bit of personal excitement. Quite another to light a lantern and call attention to the matter. He'd better stop Jodah before he roused the whole camp with his foolishness. Besides, thought Togath with a grin, it was his turn. The large guard pulled back the tent flap and said, "Lad, I hate to interrupt, but if you've had your fun." His words died in his throat as he saw the pair kneeling on the dirt floor of the tent. The woman's monocles were laying to one side, and she was rubbing her wrists. Both the lad and the woman looked up at once. They had the look rabbits get when you surprise them. Then the woman raised one hand and balled it into a fist. Togath felt something warm and wet spread over the front of his brain. Then the woman pulled her fist toward her, and the wet something seemed to be pulled through the front of his skull. It was as if she had dug a fishhook into his brain, and just pulled. It happened very quickly. Togath managed to say what the before slamming into the soft earth. "What did you do to him?" said Jodah sharply. "A spell of amnesia," said the woman in a matter-of-fact manner. "He'll wake up in an hour with no memory of having seen us. We'll be gone by then." "Gone," said Jodah. "Gone," repeated the woman. "We're going to put as much distance as we can between us and this camp. I know of a safe place we can hide, then I can take a ship west." The woman started for the tent opening, but Jodah remained still. "No," he said. The woman blinked, then her brows narrowed. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean there are others who are prisoners here," said Jodah, "prisoners of the church. We have to free them too." "Free them too," the woman choked on her voice. "Are you insane?" "Insane enough to try to free you," said Jodah, his voice stern and level. The woman's face tightened. "I could leave you here." Jodah nodded. "You could. But you said the Primatus trap caught you when you went looking for Fosca. You went after Fosca for a reason. I think that same reason will keep you from abandoning me now." The formerly blue woman balled one hand into a fist and stomped the ground. She looked as if she was going to curse, but instead she said, "How do you want to do this?" Jodah breathed a sigh of relief. "Are there any other spellcasters in the group?" "Real wizards, like you and me?" questioned the woman. "Most of them are just penny-ante alchemists and fortune-tellers. One or two scholars who are guilty of just asking the wrong questions. There's one who claimed to be a necromancer, but he's just crazy. He's probably also the only one who can really cast spells." "Go get him first then," said Jodah, "and try to free as many of the others as you can. I'll make a distraction on the other side of the camp. Can you use your induce vomiting spell?" "Induce vom," said the woman, then almost smiled. "Almost. You mean the unbalancing, the one I used in the alley?" "Yes, I can use that spell, but I can't do it all that often. We could use it to clear the way out of here." "Good," said Jodah. "Wait 15 minutes after I leave, then get to work. The horses are staked just west of here, on the side of the hill. Meet me there." "Fine," said the woman, clearly uneasy. "You have any weapon I can use?" "I could take your friend's sword, but that will likely attract too much attention." Jodah reached down in his boot and pulled out his dagger and Fosca's mirror. The woman took the dagger, but her eyes were locked on the mirror. "Hold on to that," she said simply, nodding to the mirror. "It will probably be useful." Jodah headed for the tent flap and paused to look at Togath, sprawled out on the floor of the tent. "It's better to leave him inside than out," said the woman, seeming to read Yodah's thoughts. "If we succeed, there's going to be too much confusion for anyone to think of questioning him. And if we fail—" She let her voice trail off for a moment. "You really want to do this? You don't know these people." Jodah snorted. "I don't even know your name, and I helped you." The woman straightened, stung by Yodah's words. Then she said, "Sima. I am Sima of the City of the Shadows. And don't worry, you can count on me to do my job. I'll free the other prisoners and be along presently." Jodah looked at the woman, nodded, and was gone. Slowly, Jodah moved through the camp, weaving slightly, looking like nothing more than a slightly inebriated soldier returning from a session of gambling in one of the tents. He moved carefully through the various units, taking note of which troops were where. They were well within Ghed territory, and except for the guards on the prisoners, there were few pickets. The great wagon filled with books, and/or treasure, was parked near a great white tent. Earlier in the evening the tent had been illuminated from within with a pale light, but now it was dark, and the guards nodded off at the doorway. Jodah looked up at the overcast sky, took a deep breath, and conjured the memories of the land. He took the memory energies, the mana the woman spoke of, and concentrated them into little seeds, each seed no larger than his thumbnail. He kept the memories alive as he moved around the perimeter of the great tent, dropping a seed to the ground, then stepping on it, then moving on. No one seemed to notice him as he did so. The memories grew hot in his mind and started to burn, to sear the edges of his imagination like hot coals dropped onto velvet. He had never held the memories, called upon their power without using them, for this long before. As the back of his mind grew warmer, he wondered how badly he could hurt himself casting spells. He finished his orbit of the command tent and wandered toward the wagon. His mind was aflame now, and he thought he could smell ammonia in the back of his nose. A husky shape, another guard, loomed up out of the darkness. "You're out of quarters," said the soldier. "Report at once to." There were some shouts far away, coming from the prisoner tents. The soldier looked toward the shouts, and his hand drifted to his sword. That was when Jodah released the power of the mana seeds he had planted. Light erupted in glowing fountains around the command tent and the wagon, sparking upward like hot, white fireworks set in the ground. The soldier who had accosted Jodah had been directly above one and now clawed at his face as small embers of light glowed brightly in his beard. The command tent was already smoldering from the heat, and there were shouts from within. A few feet away the first tongues of flame licked the underbelly of the wagon. Books, thought Jodah as the flames spread into the wagon itself. It was carrying books, not treasure. The casting had exhausted him, and Jodah now just wanted to curl up and sleep, but the camp was up and swarming like an overturned beehive. Instead, he ran for the center of camp. There were screams and shouts around him and orders barked as the commanders sought to protect the churchmen, extinguish the fire, and chase the prisoners all at once. Jodah took a deep breath and bellowed, "Goblins! We're under attack! Goblins!" and rushed toward the perimeter of the camp. Several of the would-be firefighters charged out into the darkness as well, ready to engage an imaginary enemy. Jodah circled around, his breath ragged and hoarse in his ears. Twice he passed small squads heading out into the night, seeking to find the supposed enemy. Others had quickly picked up his cry, and soldiers were now hopping out of their quarters half-dressed but looking for the goblins. Jodah headed through the confusion for the prisoner tents. A pack of prisoners, still manacled together but not hobbled, lurched into view, then froze at the sight of him. Jodah pointed away, a direction out of camp, and the prisoners, like some multi-legged monster, shuffled quickly out of sight. Jodah smiled grimly. Apparently he could count on the woman named Sima to do her job. There was the sound of swords striking each other in the distance, and Jodah wondered if some of the prisoners had armed themselves. Instead he briefly caught a grim tableau, a unit of soldiers locked in battle with what looked like animated skeletons. The skeletons fought silently, their long, curved blades drawing blood from their assailants with every strike. The soldiers' blows chopped off hunks of bone, but the skeletons would not stop attacking until they had been totally dismembered. The supposed necromancer, Jodah realized. Apparently he had the ability to cast spells after all. Jodah felt empty, exhausted, but clutched onto Fosca's mirror as a talisman while he moved through the camp. The various unit commanders were regaining control of their troops. Regardless of the situation, the prisoners had only minutes to make good their escape. Finally he reached the paddock on the hillside, overlooking the camp, where the horses had been staked. Most of the guards had been called back into the camp, and the horses, smoke in their nostrils, were pawing the earth and pulling at their tie ropes. Jodah stopped and took a deep breath. Sima came loping up the hill, breathing hard, her face as haggard and exhausted as Jodah felt. She turned slightly, waving at the pandemonium in the camp beneath them. "Happy, now," she said. Jodah nodded, and said, "Now we can leave, milady." "I think not," said another voice, stepping out from behind the horses. Aiding sorcerers is a sin. And a crime. Your journey ends here, my children. Yoda looked up and saw the massive form of Primata Delphine emerge from the shadows. The big woman was sweating profusely, and Yoda knew that she had probably run here as well, hot on their heels. The light of Tal illuminates all, said the priestess. When the attack came, my first concern was for the books, but they are already lost. Then I realized that any attacker would likely think of gathering the horses. The wisdom of Tal lead me to you. Yoda clutched his sword with one hand, Fosca's mirror with the other. He searched his mind but could not concentrate on the land, could not count on the memories. His mind was exhausted. The Primata was quoting scripture now. Bathed in the hallowed light, the infidels looked upon the impurities of their souls and despaired. As she spoke, her form began to glow, first like a tent lit from within, and then bright enough to bathe the entire hillside in near daylight. The horses, with the exception of the Primata's own ivory-shaded mount, thundered their hooves against the ground and tried to uproot their stakes. Yoda turned to Sima and said, "Can you do that unbalancing?" But the question died in his throat. The woman from the City of Shadows was already doubled over, clutching at her belly, her face worn and white in the luminous glow of the priestess. "She is unworthy of Tal's beneficent light," said Primata Delphine, "as are you." Again she quoted scriptures, "And I will take a sword to the infidel and the unbeliever, and my blade shall shine with the fire of righteousness." The Primata raised a hand, and the air seemed to coalesce into a flaming sword in that hand. That was enough for the horses. Wide-eyed and foam-mouthed, they ripped their ropes from the earth and were gone into the darkness, running all directions. The only one unfazed was the white gelding, Delphine's mount. Primata Delphine pointed the flaming blade at Yoda, and white-hot fire leapt from the tip, arching toward him. Yoda reached into his mind and found nothing, no memory, no ready spell, only a regret that he would never see his family's manor again. Instinctively he threw up his hands to ward off the blow, the mirror and the blade striking each other as he did so. The flame from priestess's sword struck the crossed mirror and sword, hesitated for a second, and then doubled back, leaving Yoda unharmed. The holy fire struck the Primata in the chest, and her robes now glowed of a new radiance, of the crimson flame of burning cloth. The Primata screamed, and her flaming blade disappeared, and she dropped to the ground, rolling to extinguish the blaze, the slope carrying her down the hill. Yoda lowered his arms, then looked at the blade and the mirror. The mirror was magical after all and had the power to turn the church's work against it. He gripped his sword and began to chase down the hillside after the smoldering form of the priestess. He got no more than 10 feet when he saw a line of human shapes in black and green armor coming up the slope. They scattered as the flaming priestess rolled down among them, then, realizing who was on fire, chased after her. Cursing, Yoda climbed back up the hill where the Primata's gelding still stood, nibbling at the grass. Yoda grabbed Sima's shoulder and dragged her to her feet. He half led, half shoved her toward the Primata's horse. The horse was laconic as Yoda hoisted the other spellcaster onto its back. The activity was enough to rouse her fully, and Sima pulled him up behind her. From horseback they looked down on the camp. There were a number of fires within the camp now, but it seemed that matters were slowly being brought under control. The collection of green and black figures had stopped the tumbling fireball that was the Primata Delphine, and half the force remained with her while the rest of the soldiers were working their way up the hillside toward them. "Time to leave, good Lady Sima," Yoda said, and he jammed his heels into the flanks of the horse. The gelding leapt forward, both Yoda and his companion hanging onto its mane for dear life. Direction did not matter to Yoda as much as distance. Exhausted and hungry, they rode until the early morning hours, when the eastern sky shone red with the promise of a sunrise that never seemed to come. Only then did they halt long enough to let the horse water. "Where are you going now?" she asked. Yoda shook his head, "I don't know. I stayed here because Fosca." His voice died, "I don't know if I can go home, either." The woman nodded sternly. Then come with me, there is a safe house we use south of here. I could use your help in reaching it. And you need some real training in magic. Jodah turned over the woman's words in his mind, looking for some slight against Fosca's training. It was there, he realized, but he decided it was better to ignore it. At length he said, I think that would be best, after all.